Welcome, seekers of truth and depth. Today, we journey into one of the most profound concepts ever introduced by the legendary Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung: individuation. But this isn't just a psychological term, it's a sacred path, a spiritual unfolding, a confrontation with the self that dares to challenge everything you thought you knew about who you are. In this lecture, Carl Jung, the real meaning of individuation, we are going beyond surface-level interpretations. We will uncover how Jung saw individuation not as self-improvement, but as self-realization, a deep encounter with the unconscious, the shadow, the archetypes, and the divine core of the psyche. This is not a comfortable process, but it is the only path toward becoming whole. If you've ever asked, who am I beneath the roles, the ego, and the noise, then this lecture is your invitation to discover Jung's radical and transformative answer. Carl Jung's concept of individuation stands as one of the most vital cornerstones of analytical psychology, and at its heart lies the critical principle of integrating the conscious and unconscious mind. Individuation is not a casual journey of self-help or mere self-understanding. It is a deep psychological and spiritual process that demands inner confrontation, transformation, and synthesis. The conscious mind, representing our awareness, rational thought, and day-to-day identity, often functions disconnected from the vast realm of the unconscious, which houses repressed memories, instincts, ancestral patterns, archetypes, and unacknowledged dimensions of the psyche. This disconnection breeds inner conflict, fragmentation, and suffering. Individuation seeks to bridge that chasm. It is not merely about acquiring knowledge of the unconscious, but about forming a living relationship with it. Jung understood that, when the unconscious is ignored or suppressed, it exerts a covert influence on our behaviors, choices, dreams, and even our physical health. It leaks through symptoms, neuroses, projections, and irrational behavior. The first step toward individuation, therefore, involves making the unconscious conscious, not in a theoretical way, but through a gradual and often painful process of self-confrontation and symbolic insight. This process does not happen through intellectual effort alone. It is aided by dreams, fantasies, synchronicities, inner images, and active imagination, tools that allow us to engage with the language of the unconscious. Jung believed that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious because they bypass the defenses of the ego and reveal the deeper truths of the soul. When we begin to interpret and honor our dreams not just as mental activity, but as messages from the deeper self, we begin to dissolve the wall between the conscious and the unconscious. Every time we encounter a dream symbol, we are standing at the edge of a mystery that reflects our current psychological state and invites transformation. This is not about decoding symbols with a dictionary, but developing an intimate dialogue with the psyche, respecting its images, feelings, and symbols as expressions of real psychic energy. But the integration of the unconscious is not always a pleasant experience. It often involves the emergence of dark, unfamiliar, or disturbing content. This is where the shadow, the repressed or denied aspects of our personality, begins to show itself. The conscious ego resists these revelations because they threaten our self-image, yet individuation demands that we not only face these parts but accept their reality and learn from them. This is the process of confronting and integrating the shadow, which is itself a gateway to the deeper layers of the unconscious. As we make peace with these denied aspects, we gain access to hidden energy, creativity, and authenticity that were previously locked away. The shadow is not only composed of negative traits, but also of undeveloped potential and unlived life. Integration of the unconscious also involves the gradual encounter with archetypes, universal patterns or motifs that reside in the collective unconscious. These include figures such as the wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the trickster, and others. They appear in our dreams, myths, and religious images, often guiding or obstructing us in our inner journey. Jung taught that engaging with archetypes helps the ego understand that it is not the center of the psyche. This humbling insight leads to a greater openness to the self, the totality of the psyche that transcends and includes both conscious and unconscious elements. The self is not an abstract ideal, but a living reality that seeks to emerge as the ego relinquishes control and listens to the inner voice of truth. One of the most important mechanisms through which the integration process occurs is the tension of opposites. Jung observed that the psyche often operates through the conflict between polarities, masculine and feminine, thinking and feeling, light and dark, introversion and extroversion. Rather than choosing one pole over the other, individuation involves holding the tension between these opposites until a third, higher perspective emerges. This is known as the transcendent function. It is not created by the ego, but arises spontaneously when the ego is willing to endure the discomfort of paradox and remain in dialogue with the unconscious. This synthesis brings about a new level of consciousness in which previously conflicting elements are harmonized. Jung also warned that the integration of the unconscious can be overwhelming if not guided by a strong, grounded ego. Therefore, individuation is not the dissolution of the ego but its maturation. A weak or inflated ego may either reject the unconscious entirely or be swallowed by it, leading to inflation, psychosis, or spiritual delusion. A balanced ego, however, can enter into relationship with the unconscious without being dominated by it. It becomes a vessel through which the deeper truths of the psyche can manifest in the world. This relational approach transforms the ego from a rigid controller into a servant of the self. This transformation is essential to living a meaningful and psychologically rich life. Another key aspect of the integration process is authenticity. As the individual becomes more aware of unconscious patterns, social conditioning, inherited complexes, and internalized ideals, a natural stripping away of false identities occurs. The person begins to ask, what is truly mine? What comes from my own inner truth? This stage of the journey is often marked by inner crisis, loneliness, or existential anxiety. However, these are signs that the old personality structure is breaking down to make room for a more integrated and whole self. This can lead to changes in values, relationships, career, and lifestyle. Individuation is not simply a private affair, but has outward consequences because the more integrated a person becomes, the more they begin to express their unique psychological fingerprint, their true individuality, not their persona. Symbols and rituals can support the integration process by creating sacred space for inner work. Art, writing, myth, nature, and meditation all serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms. Jung often worked with patients who were not able to articulate their inner life in words, and he encouraged them to draw, paint, or sculpt what they saw in dreams or imagination. These symbolic expressions allowed unconscious content to be embodied and witnessed by the conscious mind. Through this creative process, the psyche begins to heal itself. Healing, in Jungian terms, does not mean eliminating suffering but restoring a dynamic balance between inner forces. This balance is never static but is continually renewed through ongoing dialogue between ego and self. Individuation also involves ethical responsibility. As unconscious content surfaces and is integrated, the individual becomes more aware of their impact on others and the world. This new consciousness does not lead to perfection, but to humility and a sense of connection with something larger than the personal ego. Jung described this as a religious attitude, not bound to dogma or creed, but rooted in awe, reverence, and surrender to the mystery of life. When the unconscious is integrated, life becomes a spiritual journey marked by inner guidance, symbolic insight, and meaningful transformation. The person no longer feels adrift or alienated but anchored in a deeper ground of being, capable of acting with integrity, creativity, and love. The shadow is one of the most crucial and provocative concepts in Carl Jung's analytical psychology, and its integration is essential to the process of individuation. Jung understood the shadow as the unconscious aspect of the personality that the ego refuses to acknowledge, the traits, desires, impulses, and memories that we repress because they do not align with our conscious self-image. These disowned parts do not vanish. Instead, they gather energy in the unconscious and exert influence in indirect, often disruptive ways. The shadow is not only made up of so-called negative qualities like jealousy, rage, laziness, selfishness, or aggression, but can also contain powerful creative potentials, talents, and instincts that have been exiled from consciousness. Confronting the shadow means recognizing these elements as part of the self rather than continuing to project them onto others or externalize them in destructive ways. Without this confrontation, we live in a fragmented and distorted relationship with reality, bound by denial and inner division. Jung believed that everyone has a shadow, and the more we identify with a moral, righteous, or idealized image of ourselves, the darker and more dangerous the shadow becomes. This is because the psyche seeks balance, and when the ego inflates with virtue or superiority, the unconscious compensates by containing the opposites that are denied expression. The shadow then appears in our dreams, fantasies, slips of the tongue, compulsive behaviors, irrational fears, or in strong emotional reactions to others. We may find ourselves judging someone harshly only to discover that they embody a quality we are unwilling to see in ourselves. This is projection, a psychological defense mechanism that allows us to distance ourselves from the shadow by attributing it to others. But the more we project, the less we grow, because projection reinforces our blindness and blocks the path to individuation. The encounter with the shadow is not merely about acknowledging personal flaws or moral weaknesses. It is a deep existential meeting with parts of the psyche that feel foreign, threatening, or even monstrous. It can evoke shame, guilt, fear, or inner resistance. Yet Jung insisted that the shadow is not our enemy, but our teacher. By facing it with honesty and courage, we begin to dismantle the illusions of the ego and move toward authenticity. The shadow confrontation can happen gradually through dream work, introspection, therapy, or life crises that break through our defenses. Sometimes it is a painful experience triggered by external events, a betrayal, a failure, a loss, that forces us to see the darkness within. Other times, it arises through a conscious effort to explore our unconscious material and question the assumptions we hold about ourselves. Jung was clear that the goal is not to eliminate or overcome the shadow, but to integrate it, to bring it into conscious awareness and relate to it. This process involves taking responsibility for our own darkness and refusing to scapegoat others for what we deny in ourselves. It also involves cultivating a capacity for inner dialogue, where the ego listens to what the shadow has to say without falling into identification with it. If we simply suppress or ignore the shadow, it gains power and becomes more dangerous. If we identify with it, we risk acting out destructive tendencies and losing contact with moral orientation. Integration means holding the tension between these poles, allowing the shadow to inform and enrich our consciousness without letting it dominate our behavior. When the shadow integrated, something profound shifts within the individual. There is a release of psychic energy that was previously bound in repression. This energy can be redirected toward creativity, passion, authenticity, and purpose. We become more whole, less reactive, more self-aware, and more capable of real relationship, because we are no longer projecting our darkness onto others. The people we once condemned or envied become mirrors that help us see ourselves more clearly. We begin to recognize that the world is not divided into good and evil, but is a reflection of the psychic reality within us. This awakening is not an intellectual realization, but a transformation of perception and being. The shadow also plays a crucial role in the development of compassion. When we understand the darkness in ourselves, we are less likely to judge others harshly. We see that everyone carries burdens, wounds, and contradictions. We become more human, more grounded, and more capable of empathy. This does not mean we excuse harmful behavior or lose our discernment, but that we respond from a place of depth rather than self-righteousness. The integrated person does not need to pretend to be perfect. They can admit their flaws and still act with integrity. This humility is one of the signs that the shadow has been meaningfully encountered. In mythological terms, the shadow often appears as the dragon, the monster, or the adversary that the hero must face on the journey of transformation. Jung saw this mythic structure as a psychological truth. The shadow must be met and wrestled with, not avoided. It guards the treasure of the self, and only through confrontation can the inner gold be claimed. This motif appears in countless spiritual and religious traditions, where the dark night of the soul precedes illumination, or where death and rebirth are necessary for spiritual evolution. Jung's genius was to recognize these motifs not just as outer stories, but as inner maps of the psyche. Individuation cannot proceed until the shadow is brought into the light, because the shadow holds the key to the parts of ourselves that have been split off and rejected. Working with the shadow requires a particular kind of courage, not the courage of conquest, but the courage of vulnerability and inner honesty. It demands that we question our assumptions, examine our motives, and look beneath the surface of our behaviors. It asks us to sit with uncomfortable truths and not turn away. This kind of work is often aided by therapeutic relationships, spiritual practices, or solitude, where we create space for introspection and self-confrontation. The shadow is subtle and elusive, and it hides behind many disguises, including virtue, conformity, and idealism. Therefore, the process of uncovering it is ongoing and ever-deepening. As we evolve, new layers of the shadow revealed, inviting us into deeper levels of self-awareness. This inner work not only transforms the individual, but contributes to the healing of collective consciousness. Jung warned that what is not integrated in the individual psyche tends to be projected onto the collective, leading to prejudice, violence, and mass delusion. Societies, like individuals, have shadows, collective fears, biases, and blind spots. By doing our personal work, we reduce the fuel for these collective projections and participate in the evolution of human consciousness. The person who integrates their shadow becomes a light bearer, not because they are without darkness, but because they no longer fear it. They can walk in both light and shadow with integrity and presence, capable of influencing the world not through domination, but through depth and authenticity. Carl Jung's theory of individuation revolves around one central truth, that the goal is not the perfection of the ego, but the realization of the self. This distinction is vital to understanding the psychological and spiritual depth of his work. In much of modern culture, the self is mistakenly equated with the ego, the conscious identity, the personality, the part of us that navigates the outer world. Ego perfection implies the sharpening of this surface layer of identity, often through the pursuit of achievement, moral virtue, success, control, or personal development. But for Jung, such striving ultimately leads to a dead end if it remains confined to the ego's domain. The ego is a necessary structure, but it is not the whole of the psyche. It is a fragment, a small center of awareness within a much larger and more complex system that includes unconscious processes, archetypal energies, emotional complexes, and the deep organizing principle Jung called the self. The self, in Jungian terms, is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, and it represents the true center of psychological life. It is not to be confused with the ego, though the ego is contained within it. The self is not simply a higher self or a better version of who we are. It is the deeper wholeness from which our sense of identity emerges. It is transpersonal, mysterious, and often perceived through symbols, dreams, and numinous experiences. The self communicates with the ego through indirect means, inner images, archetypal patterns, synchronistic events, and gradually pulls the individual toward greater integration and authenticity. To realize the self is to undergo a recentering of consciousness, in which the ego relinquishes its claim to absolute control and acknowledges a higher order guiding the psyche from within. This realization is not the result of willpower or egoic striving. In fact, it often begins with a breakdown or disillusionment that exposes the limits of the ego's understanding. A person may encounter a life crisis, a spiritual emptiness, or a conflict they cannot resolve through logic or control. These experiences open the door to the unconscious and initiate the journey inward. Jung believed that suffering, confusion, and inner tension are often necessary catalysts for individuation because they force the ego to confront its inadequacy and seek deeper meaning. At such times, the self begins to emerge as a guiding presence, not as a concept, but as a living reality experienced in symbolic or intuitive ways. The process of realizing the self is marked by a series of psychological challenges that require the ego to engage with unconscious content. These include confronting the shadow, meeting the anima or animus, the inner feminine or masculine, and engaging with the archetypes of transformation. Each of these encounters strips away illusions and brings hidden material into consciousness. As this process unfolds, the ego becomes more refined, more humble, more connected to the deeper currents of the psyche. But this refinement is not perfection in the moral or social sense. It is a transformation of orientation, from ego-centeredness to self-centeredness, where the self becomes the guiding principle of life. This transformation also changes the way a person relates to values, goals, and identity. Rather than trying to become a better version of themselves according to cultural or external standards, the individuating person seeks to live in accordance with their inner truth. This often involves letting go of ideals that once seemed important: success, popularity, control, security, in favor of authenticity, depth, and meaning. It may lead to changes in career, relationships, or lifestyle as the person aligns more fully with what their soul is asking of them. This alignment is not always comfortable or easy. It requires sacrifices, risks, and a willingness to stand apart from conventional norms, yet it brings with it a deep sense of inner fulfillment and coherence, because life is no longer lived from the surface, but from the center. Jung often spoke of the self as manifesting through symbols of wholeness: the mandala, the circle, the divine child, the wise old man or woman. These images appear in dreams and visions as signs that the psyche is moving toward integration. They are not merely mental constructs, but carriers of transformative energy. When such symbols arise spontaneously, they evoke a sense of sacredness, awe, or recognition. They mark a turning point in the individuation process, where the ego begins to experience itself as part of something greater. This shift can be subtle or dramatic, but it always brings a reorientation of purpose and perception. The individual feels called, not by external demands, but by an inner necessity that cannot be denied. Realizing the self also has a moral and ethical dimension. As consciousness expands, the person becomes more aware of their responsibility, not in the sense of conformity to rules, but in the sense of responding to their inner truth. They become attuned to what is right for them, not out of obligation, but from a place of alignment. This kind of integrity is born of inner listening and self-knowledge. It does not seek perfection, but honors complexity, contradiction, and human limitation. The individuated person is not flawless or immune to suffering, but they have learned to navigate life with a deeper sense of purpose and groundedness. They are less reactive, more reflective, and more capable of holding opposites within themselves. Without collapsing into confusion or dogmatism, the path to realizing the self also includes a spiritual dimension. Jung was careful to distinguish his psychology from religion, but he recognized that individuation often leads to experiences that are religious in nature. These include encounters with mystery, transcendence, synchronicity, and a sense of divine presence. Jung referred to this as the religious function of the psyche, the innate human drive to connect with something greater than the ego. He did not prescribe a specific belief system, but encouraged individuals to honor their own symbolic and spiritual experiences. These experiences are not added on from the outside, but emerge naturally from the process of psychological integration. They signal that the ego is in contact with the self, and that life is being lived in harmony with the deeper currents of being. This realization also changes the person's relationship to suffering. Whereas the ego sees suffering as a problem to be fixed or avoided, the self understands suffering as part of the soul's growth. Pain becomes meaningful when it is viewed in the context of transformation. Struggles, losses, and inner conflicts are no longer seen as failures, but as invitations to deepen one's awareness and connection to the self. This does not romanticize suffering, but honors its role on the unfolding of consciousness. The person learns to endure, to reflect, and to grow from adversity because they are anchored in something deeper than circumstances or emotional reactions. They are rooted in the self, which remains constant through all changes and upheavals. In this state of realization, the individual becomes more creative, more intuitive, and more open to life's mystery. They begin to live symbolically, recognizing meaning in events, patterns in chaos, guidance in synchronicity. Life is no longer random or mechanical, but infused with purpose, even if that purpose cannot be fully articulated. The individual is not driven by egoic ambition, but moved by a quiet inner necessity. They are not enslaved by fear or desire, but guided by a deeper knowing. This state is not static or final, but dynamic and evolving. The realization of the self is not a destination, but an ongoing process of becoming, a spiral of inner awakening, integration, and expression that continues throughout life. In Carl Jung's framework of individuation, archetypes play a fundamental guiding role in shaping the journey of the soul toward wholeness. Archetypes, as Jung defined them, are universal patterns or primordial images embedded in the collective, unconscious, a layer of the psyche that exists beyond personal experience and is shared by all humanity. These archetypes are not inherited ideas or memories, but innate potentials and organizing structures that influence how we perceive, feel, and behave across cultures, time periods, and individual lives. They express themselves through symbols, myths, religious motifs, dreams, fantasies, and even cultural narratives. As the individual progresses through the individuation process, these archetypes emerge in symbolic form, offering insight, challenge, and transformation. They are not static templates, but dynamic energies that call the ego into deeper relationship with the self, revealing the deeper architecture of the psyche as it unfolds. One of the earliest and most powerful archetypes to appear in the individuation process is the shadow, which embodies all that the ego denies, represses, or refuses to acknowledge. This archetype forces the individual to confront their own moral contradictions, buried emotions, and disowned traits. The confrontation with the shadow is often the first initiation into the unconscious and sets the stage for a deeper encounter with other archetypes. Following this, the figures of the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women, emerge to bridge the conscious ego with the deeper unconscious. These archetypes challenge and refine one's relationship to emotion, intuition, creativity, logic, and will. The anima and animus often appear in dreams as symbolic figures, a mysterious woman, a wise old man, a seductive partner, or a tyrannical voice, and they represent not only gendered traits, but also the capacity for deep psychic integration and inner relationship. These archetypal encounters are not chosen or controlled by the ego. They arise spontaneously, often through dreams, synchronicities, or overwhelming emotional experiences. Their purpose is to break the rigid boundaries of the ego and pull consciousness toward greater wholeness. Jung likened the archetypes to magnets, drawing the individual toward specific psychological tasks and transformations. They function like inner teachers, offering challenges that cannot be bypassed without cost. If one resists or denies an archetype's emergence, it may manifest in distorted or destructive forms, as obsession, projection, or irrational behavior. When honored and engaged with consciously, however, these archetypes become allies in the journey of individuation. They provide the raw material and symbolic language through which the unconscious communicates its wisdom. The archetype of the hero is another key figure that shapes the early stages of individuation. The hero represents the part of the psyche that longs to overcome adversity, face inner dragons, and prove its strength and courage. This archetype fuels the desire to embark on a quest, to confront the shadow, and to win psychological freedom. However, Jung warned that the hero can also become inflated, identifying too strongly with conquest and separation from others. True individuation requires the hero to be humbled and transformed. This often happens when the hero meets archetypes that it cannot defeat: the mother, the wise old man, the trickster, figures that do not respond to power but demand humility, insight, or surrender. These encounters mark the turning point. From ego inflation to psychic balance, the Great Mother archetype represents both nurturing and devouring aspects of the feminine. She may appear as the Earth Mother, the Virgin, the Queen, or the Terrible Mother, symbols of creation, protection, love, but also control, engulfment, or chaos. The individual must navigate this archetype carefully, recognizing the need for maternal support without becoming psychologically dependent or overwhelmed. The wise old man or old woman archetype brings another layer of transformation. These figures appear as spiritual guides, dream mentors, or inner voices of clarity. They offer wisdom and direction at moments of confusion, often helping the ego to relinquish control and open to the self. They do not impose solutions, but invite inner listening and deepened awareness. The trickster archetype plays a different role altogether. It disrupts, confuses, and breaks expectations. It can appear as a clown, a fool, a thief, or a shapeshifter. The trickster reveals the limits of the ego's control and mocks its seriousness. Jung saw this archetype as essential for psychological renewal. It teaches us to laugh at ourselves, to let go of rigid structures, and to embrace the chaos that precedes transformation. Without the trickster, individuation can become too rigid or moralistic. With it, the psyche remains fluid, creative, and capable of surprise. All of these archetypes are symbolic expressions of the self, which is the ultimate guiding force behind the individuation process. The self is not a singular archetype, but the center and totality of the psyche itself. It manifests through multiple forms, adapting to the needs of the individual in the moment. Jung observed that as individuals approach greater integration, they often encounter symbols of the self, mandalas, circles, radiant figures, or sacred centers. These symbols do not explain the self but point toward its mystery and presence. They evoke a sense of meaning, connection, and inner wholeness that cannot be rationally defined. The individual feels aligned with a deeper pattern, a sense of destiny or calling that transcends personal desire. Archetypes guide the individuation process not through instruction, but through activation. They awaken forgotten dimensions of the soul and require the ego to stretch beyond its familiar boundaries. They challenge identity, dismantle illusions, and invite new ways of being. Working with archetypes is not a matter of analysis alone. It requires symbolic perception, emotional engagement, and creative expression. Jung often encouraged individuals to draw, paint, write, or enact their dreams and fantasies, allowing archetypal energy to be seen, shaped, and integrated. This symbolic engagement creates a bridge between the conscious and unconscious realms, allowing archetypal wisdom to inform daily life. The influence of archetypes extends beyond personal psychology into culture, religion, and collective behavior. Myths, rituals, religious images, and cultural stories all reflect archetypal content. By studying mythology and religious traditions, Jung found recurring motifs that mirrored the inner life of the individual: stories of descent, sacrifice, rebirth, union, and transformation. These stories are not merely entertainment or moral instruction, they are maps of the psyche. They offer orientation, context, and depth to the inner journey. When individuals connect with these symbolic narratives, they feel less isolated in their struggles. They understand that their suffering, conflicts, and aspirations are part of a larger human pattern. Jung emphasized that while archetypes are universal, their expressions are personal. Each individual experiences them in unique ways, shaped by their life context, personality, and culture. The task of individuation is not to conform to archetypes, but to recognize them as psychic forces and enter into dialogue with them. This dialogue leads to integration, not possession. When the ego can hold its place within the symbolic field of archetypes, without being overwhelmed or inflated, the person begins to live from a deeper center. They become capable of embodying their own myth, not in imitation of others, but in creative fidelity to the inner self. Archetypes serve as initiators, guardians, and mirrors along this path, guiding the individual not to escape life, but to live it more fully, symbolically, and in alignment with the deeper reality that pulses beneath the surface of consciousness. The process of individuation, as Carl Jung described it, often involves spiritual awakening and inner transformation. This is not merely a metaphorical or poetic notion, but a lived psychological reality that arises naturally when the conscious ego begins to integrate with the unconscious and align with the deeper organizing center of the psyche, the self. Individuation is not a rational decision made by the ego to pursue spiritual insight. Rather, it is a movement initiated from within, a calling from the depths that seeks to bring the fragmented parts of the psyche into wholeness. In the course of this journey, the individual is often led through symbolic death and rebirth experiences that mirror ancient spiritual rites and mythological patterns. These inner movements reveal a sacred dimension to the psyche, showing that psychological integration is inseparable from spiritual maturation. The symbols, dreams, and intuitive insights that arise during individuation are often charged with numinous energy, producing a sense of awe, reverence, or even fear, characteristics typically associated with religious experience. Jung maintained that the human psyche has a built-in religious function, an innate drive toward meaning, purpose, and connection with something greater than the individual ego. This function does not require adherence to any particular dogma or belief system, but expresses itself in the form of symbolic experiences that transcend ordinary understanding. When the individual makes contact with this function, the process of individuation takes on a sacred character. Life is no longer viewed as a series of random or disconnected events, but as a meaningful pattern unfolding according to an inner logic that includes both light and shadow, suffering and joy. The individual begins to perceive synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that reveal a deeper order behind apparently chance occurrences. These moments feel guided, orchestrated by an intelligence greater than the conscious mind, and they often mark significant turning points in the individuation journey. Spiritual awakening within the individuation process often begins with a sense of inner disorientation. The ego, having exhausted its strategies for control, finds itself in a state of vulnerability, confusion, or even despair. This is frequently the prelude to a deeper shift in consciousness. Jung compared this stage to the dark night of the soul, a concept found in Christian mysticism where the soul feels abandoned, lost, or stripped of all certainty. This stripping away is not a failure but a necessary purification. It makes space for the emergence of a more authentic and expansive self-understanding. As the ego surrenders its illusions of dominance, it becomes receptive to the subtle guidance of the self, which begins to orient the individual toward wholeness, depth, and inner truth. Inner transformation often comes in stages and requires repeated confrontations with the unconscious. These confrontations are not always dramatic, but can be quiet, gradual shifts in perception and feeling. Over time, the individual notices changes in their values, desires, and relationship to the world. What once seemed urgent or important may lose its grip, and new priorities emerge that are more aligned with the inner reality. This may include a deeper commitment to creativity, solitude, contemplation, or service. The transformation is not about becoming someone else, but about becoming more fully oneself, not the ego's idea of self, but the self as it reveals itself through lived experience and symbolic insight. This unfolding is not linear. It involves regression, uncertainty, and repeated death-rebirth cycles in the psyche. Each cycle deepens the individual's sense of connection to the inner source, which is often described as a divine center or imago Dei. The image of God within, dreams, play a crucial role in this transformation. They frequently present archetypal imagery that points to spiritual themes: ascent, descent, light, darkness, sacred marriage, divine child, alchemical union. These images are not to be taken literally, but are to be understood symbolically, as messages from the unconscious that reveal the inner state of the psyche and its movement toward integration. Jung's method of dream analysis was not about rigid interpretation, but about entering into relationship with the symbols, allowing them to unfold meaning through dialogue, reflection, and creative expression. Active imagination, another technique Jung developed, enables the individual to engage consciously with the figures and images that arise from the unconscious, turning them into dynamic encounters that shape psychological development. These practices are not merely analytical tools, but spiritual disciplines that foster inner transformation by bridging the gap between ego and self. As the process deepens, the individual begins to feel a sense of vocation, not necessarily in the form of a career, but as a calling to live in alignment with the deeper truth revealed by the self. This sense of calling brings a feeling of inner authority, not rooted in external validation, but in fidelity to one's inner voice. The individual becomes less reactive to social pressures and more attuned to the rhythms of their own soul. They may find themselves drawn to spiritual practices, sacred texts, nature, art, or other means of connecting with the transcendent. These practices support the ongoing dialogue with the unconscious and help to stabilize the transformation taking place within. Spiritual awakening in this context is not an escape from the world, but a renewed engagement with it, grounded in deeper presence, compassion, and awareness. Jung emphasized that spiritual experiences must be integrated into daily life. A moment of illumination or visionary insight is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new task: to translate the symbolic into the concrete, to live the truth inwardly received. This means making ethical choices, accepting responsibility, and acting with integrity. Inner transformation must be reflected outwardly, or it remains incomplete. The person undergoing individuation learns to walk between worlds: the world of the visible and the world of the invisible, the world of form and the world of soul. This integration creates a stable center within the psyche, allowing the individual to face life's complexities with greater resilience, insight, and authenticity. The spiritual dimension of individuation also includes an awareness of interconnectedness. As the ego loosens its grip, the boundaries between self and other, inner and outer, begin to soften. The individual experiences a sense of unity with all life, a recognition that the same patterns and energies moving within are also moving through the world. This awareness brings a deepened sense of compassion and responsibility, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural outgrowth of inner awakening. The person begins to act not out of fear or ambition, but from a place of love and service. They become a vessel through which the self expresses itself in the world, contributing to the healing of the collective as well as the individual psyche. This ongoing transformation does not lead to perfection or escape from suffering, but to a way of being that embraces the full spectrum of human experience with openness and depth. The spiritual awakening that arises from individuation is not characterized by certainty or fixed belief, but by humility, curiosity, and reverence for the mystery of existence. The individual becomes increasingly capable of holding opposites, joy and sorrow, clarity and doubt, light and shadow, without fragmentation. This capacity is not a sign of weakness, but of wholeness, a reflection of the deep integration that has taken place through sustained inner work and surrender to the self. The goal of individuation, as Carl Jung emphasized, is psychological wholeness, not social conformity. This distinction lies at the core of his analytical psychology and defines the radical path he charted for human development. Psychological wholeness refers to the integration of all aspects of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, personal and archetypal, into a dynamic and balanced inner system. This inner harmony is not achieved by following external standards, societal norms, or moral ideals imposed from outside the self, but by living in alignment with the unique truth and structure of one's own psyche. In contrast, social conformity often involves suppressing or distorting the inner life in order to fit into collective expectations, which may bring temporary acceptance or success, but often at the cost of authenticity, vitality, and inner peace. Jung's psychology offers a countercultural vision. To become truly whole is to become truly oneself, and this process requires courage, honesty, and an inner commitment to truth that transcends the need for approval. The pressures of conformity begin early in life, as individuals are shaped by family systems, educational institutions, cultural values, religious beliefs, and societal roles. These influences teach us what is acceptable, desirable, and safe to express. In response, we develop a persona, the mask we wear to navigate the outer world, to be seen in a favorable light, to fulfill expectations. While the persona is necessary for functioning in society, problems arise when it is mistaken for the whole self. When the individual identifies too strongly with the persona, they become cut off from their inner life, from the deeper aspects of the psyche that do not conform to external roles. This disconnection leads to inner tension, repression, and a sense of alienation. The person may feel successful or admired on the outside, but inwardly they experience emptiness, depression, or anxiety because their true self is not being lived. Individuation begins when the individual starts to question the persona and listen to the inner voice that longs for something more authentic. This voice often arises during times of crisis, transition, or emotional upheaval, when the old roles and values no longer suffice. The process requires turning inward, facing the unconscious, and beginning the long, often painful task of discovering who one truly is beyond the layers of adaptation and performance. Jung believed that this journey is not about rebelling against society for its own sake, but about realizing that true contribution to the world can only come from a person who is inwardly whole. Psychological wholeness does not reject society, but it does require stepping outside of collective norms long enough to discern one's individual path. As the individual moves deeper into the work of individuation, they encounter parts of the psyche that have been marginalized, repressed, or denied. These include the shadow, complexes, forgotten memories, unlived desires, and archetypal energies that lie beneath the surface of consciousness. Each of these elements carries a piece of the person's totality and must be acknowledged and integrated. In order for wholeness to be realized, this is not an abstract or theoretical task, but a lived psychological experience, often marked by dreams, emotional breakthroughs, symbolic insights, and inner conflicts. The more the individual integrates these aspects, the less they are driven by unconscious forces, and the more they are able to make conscious choices that reflect their inner truth rather than external pressures. Social conformity, by contrast, encourages repression of the inner life in favor of uniformity and predictability. It rewards adaptation, not authenticity. Individuals who conform may find temporary security, but over time, they often experience symptoms of psychic fragmentation, lack of meaning, feelings of inauthenticity, unexplained fears, compulsive behavior, or chronic dissatisfaction. Jung saw these symptoms not as pathological in themselves, but as signs that the psyche is calling for integration and change. He believed that neurosis, in many cases, is the result of a conflict between the demands of society and the needs of the individual soul. When the soul is not heard, it suffers, and this suffering is often the first signal that individuation is necessary. Psychological wholeness requires a reorientation of values, rather than seeking validation from others. The individuating person seeks resonance with their own inner experience. They begin to make decisions based on inner guidance, symbolic meaning, and a growing sense of alignment with the self. This process is not selfish or narcissistic. It involves great humility, because the self is not the ego's creation, but a deeper organizing principle that must be served. To live in service to the self is to surrender the illusion of control and to trust the unfolding of the inner life. It means making room for mystery, contradiction, paradox, and change, elements that are often unwelcome in a culture obsessed with clarity, certainty, and perfection. Wholeness also includes accepting one's limitations and imperfections. Jung was adamant that individuation does not lead to moral or psychological perfection, but to a deeper acceptance of the full range of human experience. The whole person is not one who has eliminated all flaws, but one who has integrated them into a conscious framework of understanding and compassion. They are no longer ruled by fear, shame, or the need to appear ideal. Instead, they live from a place of grounded authenticity, where inner truth is more important than outer approval. This freedom allows for real connection with others, because it is based not on performance, but on presence. In the context of society, the individuated person often becomes a source of renewal. They are not easily swayed by collective hysteria or blind conformity because they have developed an inner compass. They can think independently, feel deeply, and act ethically from a place of inner conviction. Such individuals are often the artists, visionaries, healers, and reformers who bring fresh insight into the collective. But this role is not chosen by ego ambition. It arises naturally from the integrity of the inner journey. By living their own truth, they create space for others to do the same. They challenge norms not for rebellion's sake, but because truth demands expression. The path to wholeness requires solitude, reflection, and ongoing dialogue with the unconscious. It cannot be rushed, forced, or imposed from the outside. It unfolds organically, guided by the rhythm of the psyche and the archetypal patterns that shape human life. Jung often likened this path to an inner alchemy, where the raw materials of the self are transformed through the fire of self-awareness and the vessel of containment. The goal is not escape from the world, but full presence within it, with a consciousness that is rooted in the self rather than scattered by the demands of the crowd. The individuated person may still participate in society, but they do so from a different center, one that is free, whole, and deeply human.